So I would like to welcome Nunavut's government to make the first presentation.
Perfect. Thank you very much. This presentation is going to focus on some of the issues that we've raised throughout the panel hearing process and throughout the environmental assessment process over the past year and a bit, and also focus on some solutions that we have submitted as part of an earlier written submission. So, throughout the hearings, the Nunavut government has emphasized connection and the fact that Inuit cultural, social, and human health are directly tied to the health of the natural environment. This has been the case for hundreds of years and will continue to be the case whether the proposed project proceeds or not. Inuit health and well-being depends on the health of the natural environment. This slide has been shown repeatedly and is one of the focal points of our widely differing views of the project from that of the proponent. We can see the aquatic assessment area that was used by the proponent to conduct work in preparation for the EIS, and the fact that it was basically restricted to the main stem of the Churchill River, with the vast majority of the work upstream of the proposed dam sites. However, that did not prevent the proponent from making predictions about the downstream environment, nor did it in any way hinder their confidence in those predictions. Having said that, the proponent predicts increases in total phosphorus, total suspended solids, total mercury, and methylmercury in fish, zooplankton, and water in the red area. Based on the research and review we have done, the independent expertise we have consulted, and the Inuit knowledge that is available, the Nunavut government believes there will be significant biophysical effects of the project throughout the entirety of Lake Melville. The proponent heavily relies on an interpretation that Goose Bay Narrows is a barrier. Inuit know better. They know that this location is a passageway, an area of exchange through which water, nutrients, zooplankton, fish, and seals readily pass in both directions, and this will be further discussed throughout the presentation. Two of the main questions that we have asked and sought answers to throughout the EIS were, what is the likelihood of an increase in methylmercury levels in Lake Melville as a result of the proposed project? And are there risks of adverse social and health impacts on Inuit associated with the project? These are just reminders of some of the specific issues and divergent views of the project with respect to downstream effects that we have previously discussed or written about. There will be a shift in flow patterns during the spring, and interannual variability is going to be dampened and lost. If this project goes ahead, mean annual flow patterns may stay similar upon dam construction, but the critical, large-scale, interannual fluctuations upon which ecosystems depend for their health will be compromised. This will be akin to removing fire from a terrestrial system, preventing that crucial trigger of regeneration. With respect to nutrients below Muskrat Falls, Nalcor has ignored nitrogen, silicates, and other nutrients. They have only looked at phosphorus, and yet they still maintain a conclusion of no measurable changes to nutrients, which we assume is all nutrients. We're not sure how a conclusion can be drawn about nutrients when the majority of nutrients have not been considered. Nalcor has also stated sea ice will not be compromised in Goose Bay and Lake Melville. There's great uncertainty in this claim, as no specific data or modeling were done in Goose Bay or Lake Melville to support this. This is the first time in this presentation that we encounter a comment from Dr. Sunderland's review of the proposed project, which was previously sent to the panel as a written submission. So I will give a brief background. As stated in the written submission, Dr. Sunderland is a professor of aquatic science in the Department of Environmental Health at the Harvard School of Public Health. Prior to her tenure at Harvard, she was senior staff with the Council for Regulatory Environmental Modeling at the United States Environmental Protection Agency Office of Research and Development. She is one of the most respected aquatic scientists in North America with a focus on mercury. Well, why did we engage her? Upon announcement of panel hearings, we were concerned that, some of our we thought some of our concerns weren't getting across, I guess. And we thought that, and at that point we emailed the panel asking if the panel had engaged any technical expertise. Throughout this process, the panel is expected to be an expert in everything, apparently. And it's really difficult to do. So we thought engaging this world-class independent expert would help the panel to determine whether there would be, or the extent of effects through Lake Melville, if there were effects at all. So Dr. Sunderland's review is document 1246 on the CEAA website. The purpose of her review was not to examine or acknowledge commitments made to monitoring and follow-up. It was to ask a simple question. What is the likelihood of an increase in methylmercury levels in Lake Melville as a result of the proposed Lower Churchill hydroelectric development, and are there risks of adverse impacts associated with it? Her review draws on her significant expertise to formulate conclusions. Dr. Sunderland reviewed all information needed to generate an understanding of the questions and concerns. This included relevant component studies, relevant information responses, and relevant undertakings. Being a professor at Harvard, I think we can trust that she is capable of researching the topic to a level that she feels comfortable offering an expert opinion. Her opinions are not only thoughtful, but they are unbiased, as she has nothing to gain or lose from this process. This is important to note. Finally, she is well aware of the relationship between the Churchill River, Goose Bay, and Lake Melville, including the Narrows, and she conducted her review accordingly with a holistic understanding of the system. We believe her thoughtful, independent, expert review will be of use to the panel. To state otherwise, as has been suggested by the proponent, because her assessment does not agree with theirs, is not respectful of such an internationally recognized expert. With that, NALCOR has stated that there will be no measurable changes to total suspended solids. They discredit total suspended solids as an additional transport mechanism of mercury by referencing a single study from the Gulf of Mexico, which has extremely limited applicability to a subarctic system. In addition, NALCOR suggests that all the enhanced total suspended solid load associated with reservoir construction will settle out before reaching Lake Melville. But this is not based on data or field work. NALCOR has not measured anything in Lake Melville, and to date, the spatial and temporal sampling that they have conducted downstream is inappropriate for drawing meaningful conclusions. In contrast with NALCOR's prediction of total suspended solids, Dr. Sunderland states, the proponent uses a deterministic model that ignores noise to claim that the noise in these data indicate a lack of any trend. This is flawed logic. The suspended particulate matter load exhibits a high degree of natural variability, and therefore significantly more data must be gathered before anyone can claim that there is or is not a trend. Since total suspended solid concentrations vary spatially and temporally, a more robust approach would be to employ models that explicitly simulate natural stochastic variability and to examine how the magnitude of this noise translates into concentration changes after flooding. With respect to fish, NALCOR predicts the methylmercury increases will not be significant below Muskrat Falls. This is based on inappropriate modeling, which I will get onto in the next slide. Our position, which is based on the actual data that is available, suggests it is clear that there will be increases of methylmercury in fish and seals throughout Lake Melville. NALCOR suggests that mercury levels in fish from Lake Melville attributed to the Upper Churchill development, as shown in Anderson's paper, do not disagree with the effects they put forward in the Lower Churchill assessment. What is not mentioned, however, is that Anderson's work shows that fish beyond the Narrows have elevated levels of methylmercury. This agrees with the Inuit knowledge that has always viewed the Narrows as a passageway and an area of exchange. It disagrees with the assertion by NALCOR that the Narrows acts as a barrier. Anderson does not provide data from further down Lake Melville to show that elevated levels remain high, simply because the fish samples weren't available. NALCOR is trying to use Anderson's paper to suggest an outer limit. But because of the lack of fish samples further into Lake Melville, Anderson's paper cannot be considered the edge or extent of high methylmercury levels, but only that we know the extent of the effects reaches at a minimum beyond the Narrows. So methylmercury is going past the only supposed barrier in the Lake Melville ecosystem that has been put forth by the proponent. The panel needs to ask themselves, what other supposed barriers are left? And the answer, plain and simple, is none. There are no barriers. And based on this concrete information, it is highly likely that methylmercury levels will increase throughout Lake Melville as a result of the Lower Churchill. Early on in this EIS process, the proponent stated the interaction between seals and fish is just not there. We're not sure what led to this statement. Maybe it was the result of the 3-day aerial survey that has been used to unequivocally suggest no predicted effects on seals or their distribution. The panel must again ask themselves, does a 3-day survey, leaving out 362 days of a year, not to mention 365 days of every other year, provide enough information to make a statement suggesting the interaction between seals, fish, and the river is just not there? Especially when, during the survey, seals were actually found in the lower main stem of the river. We respectfully submit that the answer is no. A simple look at stable nitrogen isotope ratios, fatty acid signatures, gut contents from seals, or better yet, asking Inuit about their knowledge with respect to seals, such as was indicated in the video documentary that we submitted, would support the proponent in coming to a more appropriate conclusion. Seals readily feed on fish and zooplankton throughout Lake Melville and the lower reaches of the Churchill River, and the interaction between seals and the project is there. Right at the beginning of this slide, I'd like to make a clarification of NALCOR's recent supplemental information submission. In it, NALCOR says that we have used Figure 1 from Rosenberg's paper incorrectly, as we knew they would say. It just so happens that the predicted extent of downstream effect made by NALCOR for this project matches the number 1 circle in Rosenberg's paper. That number 1 circle is for methylmercury, as Rosenberg describes it. However, this was a review of existing literature at the time, and we already know that almost no information exists for downstream environments, especially estuaries. In the text of the paper, Rosenberg et al. State that the downstream extent of mercury is usually less than 100 kilometers, again, based on published work at the time, which always fails to consider downstream aerial extent. Anderson stressed this in her paper in 2011. When researchers actually begin to explore this question, like Anderson did in 2011, elevated levels over 300 kilometers downstream are detected. The main point is this. The lack of data on how far mercury moves through the downstream food chain is not a reason to assume it doesn't move. What limited data there is suggests that it moves very far. NALCOR has stated that they are confident in their methylmercury models. However, given the high levels of uncertainty and sparse data, the models are not appropriate to answer the questions being asked. Because they have no actual information or data from the Lake Melville system, NALCOR relies heavily on models to claim no measurable effect. This is something that NALCOR has done many times throughout this process, using the absence of data to provide evidence of absence in terms of measurable or significant effects. Statements by the proponent suggesting that methylmercury levels will increase downstream, potentially including Goose Bay and Lake Melville, indicate that NALCOR does not understand the finding of Dr. Anderson, who reported that connectivity between the river and lake exists. NALCOR goes on to say that modeling may, in quotes, limit the ability to make accurate predictions of potential increases in methylmercury in Lake Melville, end quotes. But they continue to use models to illustrate why no measurable effect downstream is expected. For such an important issue, NALCOR cannot argue from both sides of the fence when it is convenient. NALCOR is confident in their methylmercury predictions for fish. They state that regression modeling used to predict fish mercury concentrations in reservoirs includes data from other newly created reservoirs. They go on to say that this relationship is useful as a tool for decision-making predictions. As stated by Dr. Sunderland, who in her role as professor of aquatic science at Harvard and with her expertise is in a great position to assess the applicability of this approach, She states that making predictions from correlations is not appropriate. Data from newly recreated or created reservoirs is not relevant to the discussion regarding the fate of mercury downstream from reservoirs. She goes on to say that regression modeling used to forecast fish mercury concentrations violates statistical principles by extending limited fish mercury data beyond their measurement conditions. For example, an environmental change induced by new reservoir formation. By definition, such statistical models have no predictive power. This means that such models cannot be used to forecast future conditions, i.e. fish mercury levels, because a change in the environmental conditions has rendered the statistical relationship derived with historical data inapplicable to the present situation. Even though Nalcor is confident in their methylmercury predictions for fish, it is clear that Dr. Sunderland views this model as being fatally flawed. And even if we ignored the statistical principles and laws and pretended that the regression model could be used, the average R-squared values, or coefficients of determination for downstream fish species, is 0.22, rendering the model useless a second time in terms of information it is explaining. Regression models with coefficients of variation or of determination of 0.22 would never be accepted for publication in a peer-reviewed scientific journal. So why would we accept that here? Nalcor is confident in the predicted limited extent of effects relating to the proposed project. Dr. Sunderland, however, is not so confident, stating, "I have concluded that modeling and data supporting the Lower Churchill hydroelectric development are insufficient to demonstrate methylmercury concentrations in Lake Melville will not increase." She goes further than this, saying, "There will likely be some increases in biological methylmercury concentrations throughout Lake Melville, although the magnitude of these changes is highly uncertain." Finally, Nalcor states that their methylmercury models incorporate relevant biological processes. However, basic processes like the movement of aquatic species such as fish and seal between the river and Lake Melville has not been incorporated into any of the models. With respect to zooplankton, although ResMerc represents a state-of-the-science mercury model, it simulates zooplankton dynamics at a single trophic level. This does not capture actual food web dynamics because ResMerc describes the category zooplankton with a single set of numbers instead of the large range of values that actually describe organisms ranging from micrometers to several millimeters. Sometimes such simplifications are desirable in a modeling approach. However, since the majority of methylmercury biomagnification occurs in the plankton size classes with approximate factors of 10,000 to 100,000, this represents a major uncertainty in this instance. In addition, the spatial domain of the model was limited to the reservoir site and thus did not simulate effects on the downstream environment. With respect to this, all leads to Inuit health. And the limitations in terms of the biophysical work done by the proponent means that Inuit health has not been adequately considered. Overall risks to Inuit health of even a small increase in methylmercury in country foods are likely large due to their subsistence lifestyle and high levels in fish from the initial development of the Upper Churchill. Moving on to socioeconomic impacts briefly, because of the limited project area and scope that was taken into account by the proponent, Inuit knowledge was not incorporated into the EIS. There will be impacts to the subsistence lifestyle, and those haven't been considered due to inappropriate science used to assess the extent of impact to the aquatic environment. This all cascades down from the inappropriate biophysical assessment that was conducted for downstream impacts. No negative impacts to the social environment from other large-scale industrial projects were not adequately considered in the EIS. The human health risk assessment was not done for Inuit or communities of Nunatsiavut, for example, Rigolet. There will be significant stresses to the healthcare system and social systems, especially within the Upper Lake Melville area. So, with that, will the project as described make a lasting positive contribution to the lives of Inuit living in Upper Lake Melville and Nunatsiavut? So it is not only Inuit, so having said all of that, it is not only Inuit, but also the panel who are in a difficult position. We entered the hearings with the proponent bringing a distinct lack of real data on the downstream environment with them. That means for the biophysical side, we're dependent on models for information downstream. But throughout panel hearings, it has been well documented that there are significant weaknesses in the underlying assumptions, parameterization, and spatial coverage of models used by the proponent. So we are left with the data that has been published, such as Anderson's paper, the reviews of independent experts, and credible local knowledge, including Inuit knowledge. And all of this points to one thing: effects throughout Lake Melville and effects on Inuit. On the social side, it is clear that appropriate Inuit land and resource use was not incorporated by the proponent, even though this was requested by Inuit. The limited predictions made by the proponent also resulted in omissions such as appropriate ecological risk assessments, Inuit-specific social and health effects assessments, and Inuit incorporation into human health risk assessment, to name a few. Now, the panel must make a critical determination and decision. Will the panel allow NALCOR to bring a distinct lack of real data for downstream environments with them to panel hearings and draw conclusions with high certainty? Will the panel permit NALCOR to instead use weak models that in many cases are not even appropriate or statistically valid to answer the questions at hand? And finally, will the panel allow NALCOR to say this is fine because they will monitor using a, as of yet, undetermined plan? Although we have struggled to keep up throughout this process, we believe that we have successfully now provided the panel with an alternative, one based on the technical information we have presented, the expert reviews we have submitted, the Inuit knowledge we have incorporated, and the community hearings through which Inuit voices or have voiced their concerns based on their knowledge and experiences. And with these tools, we believe the panel can now answer two fundamental questions. Will Inuit from the Upper Lake Melville area and Nunatsiavut, especially Rigolet, be significantly adversely affected by the project? And will the Labrador Inuit settlement area be significantly adversely affected by the project? We are certain, given the actual evidence that is out there, that the answer to both of these questions is yes. Monitoring is a mitigation measure, but on its own, it is of little reassurance for Inuit. Monitoring on its own is not an adequate mitigation measure for the cultural impacts that will be felt by Inuit and the environmental impacts that will take place throughout Lake Melville. Given the significant adverse effects on Inuit and the Labrador Inuit settlement area, it is clear that a structured mechanism for mitigation measures is necessary. With that, we are putting forward several recommendations, and we hope that the panel agrees with these should the project proceed. First, a Lower Churchill Accord needs to be made between the proponent and the Nunatsiavut government. Now, throughout this entire EIS process, it has been unclear where the responsibility lies with NALCOR and where the responsibility lies with regulatory authorities. Suffice it to say that where the panel determines that the responsibility lies, Inuit want to ensure that there is an accord in place with those responsible agencies or authorities. That accord would include all recommendations put forward by the Nunatsiavut government. But what would this do? This would ensure baseline establishment and monitoring of the project would be done in cooperation with, but not dependent on the federal and provincial authorities. This is a distinct lesson learned from the Voisey's Bay development. The Voisey's Bay Environmental Management Agreement and the Voisey's Bay Environmental Management Board is not functional. It's not functional because it does not have parties that are really willing engagers at the stakeholder table. So Inuit want to make sure that baseline establishment and monitoring of the project is done, but not dependent on federal and provincial authorities. This would also ensure necessary mitigation measures are in place to improve project sustainability for Inuit and ensure lasting, durable, and equitable benefits. What would this include? It would include the provision of clean and affordable power for Nunatsiavut communities to address economic disparity, enable sustainable economic development of the North Coast, and reduce environmental degradation in Labrador's Inuit communities. The proponent must provide adequate resources for comprehensive investigation into the research, development, and implementation of a number of alternative and renewable energy sources, including hydroelectric, for each of the communities. Clearing of all wood and brush within the reservoir boundaries to decrease methylmercury contamination within and downstream of the project area. Removing vegetation from within the flooded area is the only known mitigation technique to decrease methylmercury entering the food chain. It won't decrease it a lot, but it'll help, and any little bit can help. We'd also like the panel to require NALCOR and or the province to enter into consultation with an advisory committee to address through financial contributions the increased pressure on social services in the Upper Lake Melville region as a result of the project. Similar recommendations have been made by the Friendship Center, Mokami Status Women Council, Melville Native Housing Association, etc. The proponent must work with the Nunatsiavut government to create an Inuit-specific baseline of social well-being as well as mental and physical health, employment, and traditional activities before the beginning of construction. The proponent must also work with the Nunatsiavut government to develop an Inuit-specific monitoring and follow-up program addressing the above factors. The Nunatsiavut government has recommended many specific key indicators for this program, and those are contained in our written submission. We would like to see the replication of the Inuit Health Survey that was conducted in Inuit communities as part of International Polar Year for Inuit within the Upper Lake Melville region. Results are just coming forward for the Inuit communities out of this, and it's been hugely valuable to put health within a holistic context so that we're not siloing all of these decisions that affect Inuit health. This would contribute to the development of an Inuit-specific baseline of health and social well-being, upon which to monitor project-specific impacts. We're suggesting that the proponent must work with the Nunatsiavut government to create an Inuit-specific baseline of land and resource use in and downstream of the project footprint before beginning of construction, and a monitoring program that distinguishes Inuit land and resource use from Innu and other users. Once again, the Nunatsiavut government should be made an equal partner in designing and directing this monitoring program. This should include the substantial number of Inuit from the Upper Lake Melville area and Rigolet that are current land and resource users in the region. The proponent should partner with the Nunatsiavut government to carry out a comprehensive, holistic research program within Lake Melville. We already know that very little data has been gathered from Lake Melville. Well, here's the solution. This would allow environmental baseline establishment and monitoring in Lake Melville, incorporating both the Upper Churchill project and proposed Lower Churchill project in a meaningful way. We could determine impacts from the biophysical impacts from the Upper Churchill project, as well as biophysical impacts from the Lower Churchill project, if there are any. We'd be looking for NALCOR to contribute a guaranteed and annual amount to the Nunatsiavut government for implementation of this program. It's important to note that when we bring this program to the table, we're bringing $800,000 a year with us to Lake Melville. What's important with this is the Nunatsiavut government and independent research scientists would lead the program, with NALCOR being part of a stakeholder group to guide decision making. This is the only program that's been put forth throughout this entire EIS process to answer the question, at what magnitude do changes on the Churchill River, past, present, and possible future, affect the Lake Melville ecosystem? To improve the sustainability of the project, to ensure lasting, durable, and equitable benefits, a legacy fund should be established. This would be dedicated to future sustainable development initiatives, education, and Inuit-specific environmental and social research programs to mitigate adverse impacts of the project, including those on harvesting. The fund would be used to ensure benefits of the project are enhanced and adverse effects are minimized in order to promote the sustainability of the project. We suggest that the Labrador Aboriginal Training Partnership must continue, but it must continue with direct cash contributions from the proponent. Currently, there's $15 million of cash contributions put forward in this program. It's entirely put forward by the federal government. We believe that if the proponent is serious about building capacity and making this project sustainable, it should contribute cash contributions to this program. This would enhance local employment and maximize benefits to local people, including, and one of the things that we put forward here too is that the LATP and other project-related training opportunities should also happen directly within Inuit communities. And that allows women who cannot leave their home communities for long periods of time due to family commitments to also potentially benefit from this project. The proponent must ensure that Inuit from coastal communities are not disadvantaged by their place of residence. The proponent must develop a plan to transport employees to and from work sites at the proponent's expense or at the expense of their contractors. This should be developed to the satisfaction of the Nunatsiavut government. The proponent should produce a detailed strategy to manage employees who are unable to leave Goose Bay due to weather conditions along the north coast when they are rotating out of worksite camps. This should once again be done in a manner that is approved by the Nunatsiavut government. With respect to methylmercury communication, the proponent should develop a specific communication plan for elevated concentrations of methylmercury in the Lower Churchill River and Lake Melville in partnership with and at the satisfaction of all groups, especially Aboriginal groups who have a culture and lifestyle heavily dependent on country foods. This would involve the proponent engaging other groups, such as expert groups like the Northern Contaminants Program of Indian and Northern Affairs Canada, that have already established lessons learned and best practices with respect to effective contaminant communication for Inuit and Inuit communities. These are just some of I just spoke to some of the recommendations that we put forth. There are others in our written submission that was sent in to the panel. I'll just end off my presentation reminding the panel of Dr. Elsie Sunderland's, professor at Harvard University's, conclusions. She states, I have concluded that modeling and data supporting the Lower Churchill hydroelectric development are insufficient to demonstrate methylmercury concentrations in Lake Melville will not increase. That is based on several factors included in her report. She goes on to say, there will likely be some increases in biological methylmercury concentrations throughout Lake Melville. Given the vulnerability of Inuit populations to adverse effects of methylmercury exposures, high consumption rates for subsistence populations, and elevated methylmercury concentrations in many fish from prior flooding, health risks associated with the additional increases are high. I guess that brings an end to our series of presentations and submissions to the panel. We'd like to thank you for listening. I personally think that you've done a great job within the narrow guidelines and obligations under which you have had to operate. We sincerely hope that the panel finds the information we have provided to be useful in their decision making. We're looking forward to your report. I'm looking forward to getting my life back, and I'm sure you guys are too. So, thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Sheldon. Thank you, Minister McLean, for coming forward to make the closing remarks. I will just check to see if we have any questions from the panel or clarification. No questions. So thank you very much, and thank you for all your previous presentations as well.